Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Growing up, I never equated education as akin to something like owning a house. In other words, as an asset. Education seemed more like food, and your parents tried to feed you the best they could. You didn't borrow money to eat. This was true of primary as well as higher education. How things have changed. Education is now a multi-trillion-dollar market. The cost of education have skyrocketed, especially higher education, and many people become heavily indebted in order to pay for it. Joining me today to talk about this brave new world of education is economic anthropologist and NYU professor Caitlin Zaloom, author of Indebted: How Families Make College Work. Kate, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Vasant. Great to be here.
By the way, I love your name. It has like a real ring to it, Zaloom. My colleagues sort of tease me about the fact that, I think that names really matter. And, I could go on for a while, but I like the name. What's the history of that?
It's Syrian. My family is from Aleppo. And I used to get teased all the time that Zaloom sounds a little bit like the noise a superhero might make, which I found that I was really proud of. So I'm a Syrian superhero.
Yeah, it sort of also sounds like salam, but it's so much more exotic.
I'll take salam too. The meaning is perfect.
Yeah. But I like Zaloom. Well, I really enjoyed reading your book, Kate, and you're a economic anthropologist. Why don't you just start by telling us what that's all about? And I realize fully well that you might ask me which of those two words I don't understand. But, what is economic anthropology all about?
Well, thank you for asking that, because a lot of people don't know what an economic anthropologist is at all. So I study the economy from the perspective of the people who participate in it. And for me, that means especially looking into how people relate to financial products and financial markets, how they integrate that information into their relationships and into their decision making, and how it changes those relationships, both interpersonally and also in terms of the relationships, for instance, with student debt between citizens and the state apparatus, and between students and universities.
I recall that you'd written this book about traders many years ago. I thought was really interesting. And I recall having this conversation with you where you said, you were surprised at how superstitious they were. And I remember telling you also, as a trader, that get humbled so often by markets that you sort of develop this, real appreciation for a higher power. But what prompted you to write this book, Indebted?
So one of the major features that is interesting to me about markets from an anthropological perspective is just the vast amount of uncertainty involved in acting in them, whether that's from the perspective of traders who are in one way or another trying to predict the future or to make money off changes in marketplaces, or whether it is about families investing in education for the future of their kids, which may be 18 years or even more into the future.
So what made you pick this subject? Was it through students in your class and becoming aware of the debt burdens they were carrying? Like, what made you think about that? I teach a lot of students as well, and I'm so unaware of their, individual financial situations. But what got you into this?
Yeah, well, so I, like you mentioned, I started off my career studying futures traders. So you might think that that was a really long way from studying the students who I teach every day. But one of the things that really brought me to the subject of student debt was that I got to know my students here really well. And there was one student in particular who really inspired me to start looking into this question. So her name, or like the name that I use for her in the book, is Kimberly, and she was someone who I had taught in maybe 4 classes across her years at NYU. And as you know, Vasant, that is somewhat unusual. I knew her very, very well. And she came to my office one day in the spring. And when I opened the door for her, I saw that she was crying, and that was really surprising to me, because Kimberly was about to graduate, and I had expected that she would be, wanting to celebrate with me, but instead, there she was, clearly in distress. So I invited her into my office to talk about what was happening for her. And she started talking about what her education meant. And that actually brought her back to talking about her mother and her mother's expectations for her, and what her mother had wanted for her, and all the sacrifices that she had made in order for Kimberly to get a graduate education, an undergraduate education, NYU. Now, Kimberly was about to graduate with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. And she had wanted to go into work that was, not necessarily very well paid. And it was driving her to take a job which she had just been offered, a job helping companies outsource Americans' work beyond the boundaries of this country. And that was deeply distressing to her. But she felt like she had to take it because in fact, she needed to start paying on this debt within 6 months of graduation.
So you realize that this is really a much broader problem, and decided to dig into it.
Yeah, so not only is it a broader problem, but it's also a deeper problem. So there are many, and even at that point, many economists and policy people and activists who had come to understand that student debt was an enormous problem in this country. But what Kimberly showed me, and then many people who I worked with for my book Indebted, was that it's not only a problem when students graduate, it's a problem for families beginning almost immediately after children are born. The cost of college today has risen so much, and particularly since 2000, that it has redefined what it means to be middle class in the United States. That's the argument that I make in Indebted.
So in reading your book, I noticed that you had defined middle class in an interesting way, not directly in terms of income or assets, but in terms of how financially burdened a family would feel in sending their kids to college. I think you define middle class as making too much money to qualify for government support, but not enough to afford the cost of education without being indebted.
So the way that I define middle class is through education. And I do that because education, and particularly children's futures, which was supported by education, has always been at the center of what it means to be middle class in the United States since the 1830s onward, which is when we could date the origins of this thing that we call the contemporary middle class. Now, today, college in particular, which is a cornerstone of young adults' opportunity, costs enough so that there is a wide section of people who make too much money to qualify for major federal grants, for Pell Grants, that the Department of Education makes available, but cannot pay for higher education in cash.
So they're between a rock and a hard place, essentially.
Yes, and all of those people take loans. So in order to qualify as middle class, in my definition, you must take loans to be paying for higher education. But it's not only loans. It's not only loans. Families do much more than that to pay for college.
So, what's the genesis of the current problem of heavy student debt? And I want to connect this to whether higher education confers a public or private benefit. If you go back to 1862, when Abraham Lincoln pushed through a land grant act that created a number of universities such as MIT, Wisconsin, Ohio State, et cetera, and that was in response to a lot of tech innovation happening in the agricultural area. And so the assumption there was that higher education was actually a societal good. So that's sort of, what I sort of took away, from part of your book. But then you talk about how during the Reagan era, sort of it became redefined as something that was private, that the benefit was really private. And you quote David Stockman, his budget director, essentially saying something like that, right? So is that the genesis of the current problem?
Oh gosh, the genesis of the current problem. There are so many, but you are really keying into an extremely important dynamic, and that is the shift in understanding higher education as being a public good to being a private one, primarily. Okay, so there's always been tension between these two notions. But in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, higher education, from the policy perspective, became more and more thoroughly defined as a private good, by which I mean it was considered as a primary benefit to the people who receive that education and to their families, and particularly in terms of income that they would receive as a result of their education, to income to themselves, okay? Not income which might result in tax benefits, not jobs that might add to the technological scope of the nation or solve problems, but rather as benefits to themselves. And once you make that shift, okay, then it becomes logical to say that education is an asset. Education is like a mortgage. Okay, on a home, a mortgage that you are using debt to build an asset, and so loans followed on that shift in thinking. So the idea that people should pay for college with loans follows on this redefinition of education from being a public good to being a private asset.
So is part of the problem here, and I think there's several sort of related problems, right? So there, you talk about sort of a moral dilemma. There's a moral aspect to this, right? That people feel that they have a moral obligation to send their kids to the best possible school, and we'll define what best possible means. And at the same time, there's sort of a structural aspect to this where people are being encouraged to take loans to make good on that moral obligation. And in the process, what's happening is that the market, quote unquote, is inducing them to take more risk than they may be capable of assuming. Right? Is that kind of part of the problem here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a slightly different take on it because I'm an anthropologist, so I'm coming at it from that kind of angle. Another origin story that I would tell in that feeds into what you're saying, Vasant, is that from the 1980s forward, in addition to this redefinition of college education as a private good, college education at the same time became more and more important in order to secure a good job and even a good family life. So today we know that a four-year college graduate has a good chance at having a secure job with good pay. right? We also know that that four-year college graduate has a much, much, much higher chance of getting married and staying married. Right? So there's a certain amount of stability that is built into a college education that is not lost on parents or even young adults. They know that this is essential. Right? So at the same time that college education was getting more and more and more expensive, we were asking people to pay for it in loans, and young adults' possibilities for their lives was being hooked more and more closely to it. That is a recipe for parents doing anything they possibly can to make sure not only that their child receives a four-year college education if it is possible, but that they receive the college education that is going to give them the best chance at succeeding, whatever they mean by that definition.
By the way, you've got kids, right? Like, how
Yeah,
old are your kids?
13 and 15.
Okay, so they'll be going to college in a few years. How would you react if they came to you and said, Mom, like, I don't think I want to go to college? Like, how would you feel about that?
Well, first of all, my son says that all the time because he's a very serious soccer player. And so he would really, really, really like to go pro, which is unlikely to happen. So anyway, he's in the college recruitment process for soccer. But it's a question I've considered pretty closely. However, if they said that they didn't want to go to college and let's just say soccer is off the table, as a parent, I would do everything that I possibly could to get them into college. There is nothing in my very deep and wide studies that suggest that they should not go to college.
I bring this up because I've had a few guests, John Sexton, who was former president of NYU, Michael Roth, who's the president of Wesleyan, Scott Galloway, who's very critical of universities. He calls them hedge funds. Actually, I should correct that. He calls them fucking hedge funds. And I asked John this. I said, what's the problem? Why is this so expensive? And John's response was, look, I don't think everyone should go to college. Maybe 50% of the people should go to college. And when they do, they shouldn't get sort of hung up on the pecking order, which people seem to get sort of hung up on with, rankings and things. And I'll come to that also in a minute. So, he was sort of justifying sort of the high cost of NYU and saying, look, this is a research university. There's all kinds of additional benefits that you might not actually even make use of and be paying for. What's your thinking about all of this?
Well, I always take the perspective of the people who are living through the problem, and in this regard, that means spending a lot of time talking to young adults and their parents about the choice to go to college and where to go to college. And from their perspective, there's no question about going to college, and that has a lot to do with the uncertainty that we were talking about. Going to college and also going to a college that is the best fit, which is usually how they talk about it, with their young adult, is a way to ensure that that young adult will have the tools they need in order to manage the uncertainty that they will be confronting in the world after they graduate. Okay, so we tell young adults, for instance, that the job market is wildly changing, that technology is taking over, that AI is going to eliminate tons of jobs, right? We don't know exactly which ones, we don't know where, we don't know who, perhaps, but we know that it's going to be harder to get what good white collar jobs. We emphasize that the future is uncertain in many, many different ways, and that doesn't even take into account the pandemic, which we all just lived through. We know there's tremendous uncertainty, and so parents and their students see college as a way of helping young adults learn enough to know how to learn under those conditions of uncertainty. Okay? And that's actually I was just going to say that is a very foundational way of understanding what education is for that has a lineage back to John Dewey in the early 20th century. Like the way that we've understood the future and education's role in it is about preparing people for uncertainty.
Kate, I'm curious to know whether your subjects looked at education in a utilitarian way or more broadly as an opportunity for inquiry. I mean, I grew up in India, which had a very utilitarian view of education. If I told my parents I wanted to study philosophy, the first question would have been, fine, as long as you can get a job. So our choices were heavily driven by the market. An American liberal arts education is absolutely wonderful, but it has a wide variance in terms of outcomes of future earnings for the same debt burden. You interacted with 160 families in depth. How did they look at it? As a utility or as a tool for empowerment more generally?
Well, I think that there's a lot in the question that you just asked. So even in American history, all the way back, into the 19th century, there is a tension between the idea that you should get an education because you need a job, and you should get an education because it will prepare you for an uncertain future, or simply to participate in democracy. Sometimes, oftentimes those are the same thing. Sometimes they're different. The kind of uses of education has oftentimes fallen along social lines. So for instance, when African Americans were offered higher education for the first time after slavery, it was oftentimes in the capacity for preparing for low-level jobs. Oftentimes people went beyond this. Certain time, formerly enslaved people fought against it. But there was an idea that education should match the social station from which you came. Okay. And that is also true today, that there is a part of that. Now, that if you come from a disadvantaged background, that you should expect to train for a job that exists for you now. And I think that as participants in a democracy, we should think about that seriously.
Yeah, that reminds me, I think you were maybe indirectly alluding to this debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, right, who felt that Black Americans should not necessarily go for vocational kinds of jobs, but they could easily be doctors and lawyers as well, whereas I guess Booker T. Washington felt that, maybe that they should go sort of more towards the vocational side. I'm simplifying, but I'm assuming sort of that's what you were referring to.
Yes, it in fact it is, and so that sort of tension between a kind of Booker T. Washington perspective and a W.E.B. Du Bois perspective, also played out in many arenas of education, and there's a political vision that is associated with both of those positions. And one of those, the position that Black Americans should train to be low-level workers, leaves the employers in charge, right? So the idea that we should be educating young adults to push the boundaries, to push forward, to move beyond the system that we have now, that actually doesn't leave the particularly what we would today say, corporations in charge. And so how we understand education, who should get it, and how they should pay for it are very political questions.
And while we're on that subject, I think one of the things you mentioned is that Black Americans tend to have less in the way of a cushion, let's say, in terms of assets, support from grandparents, etc., than white Americans. And so they are sort of much more disadvantaged in that respect as well, that education isn't just from the immediate family. There's sort of multiple generations involved now in supporting kids' education. That's actually even getting older Americans into debt. I was clearing out one of my desks yesterday and I came across this article from 2019 from the Wall Street Journal that said 65 and still indebted. And it was talking about parents who took loans on behalf of their kids, and are still paying them off. In your sample, did you find that minorities were sort of at greater risk of getting into trouble in terms of paying back loans?
There's no question that the burden of the cost of college falls more heavily, particularly on Black Americans, but also on Latinos and particularly on women. So when we quote unquote not solve, but quote unquote solve a problem by saying that individuals should pay for it, it reproduces the social inequalities that we live with every day. And so if education is important because it can free people from those inequalities, if education is important because it can feed the minds of people who really can use the education to the best effect, both for themselves and for all of us, then we should really think about how we are asking people to pay for education, because the people who we need to participate are being burdened by the education that we are telling them should free them. And that contradiction is foundational, and it's something that really needs to be remedied.
So I want to come back to this tension between utility and empowerment, where utility isn't vocational education, but a regular 4-year liberal arts degree. Is it inappropriate to advise people with more limited means to adopt a more utilitarian or less risky view towards higher education? Like calculating things like payback periods? I mean, it's hard to breathe freely and make important life choices with that sort of debt hanging or dangling above your head.
Well, I think that people should really consider, what college is going to give them the kind of support that they need. Now, oftentimes that is public colleges and universities, but public colleges and universities today are expensive enough so that it is not always cheaper to go to a public college than it is to go to a private one with generous support. In terms of individuals, it's always going to come down to, okay, well, what is your package? And of course, people should think about that, because debt, in fact, shapes the kinds of life choices that a young adult can make. And that is very significant. And it's not only young adults, it's also the burden of paying for college shapes parents' possibilities too going forward, particularly as they save for retirement, which most Americans actually do not have secured in any way. But what I would say, as a kind of social problem, is that our public colleges and universities are far and away underfunded. All right. So one of the results of the 2008 crisis was that it accelerated a really terrible trend, which was state legislatures not investing in their state and university college systems. All right. That a trend that had already started. It started in the 1970s. State legislature cuts got much worse. Okay. And public colleges and universities educate 80% of the college students in this country. So how well those are funded is absolutely essential. It's also essential in allowing private colleges and universities to do what they do best. Okay? If we have a system where the public option is a good one, then private colleges and universities can do what they want. But right now, what we have is a broken system in which public colleges and private universities, in the imaginations of parents and students making choices, are like one big confusing amalgam. Okay.
Actually, let's push on that. This notion of a broken system, right? So in what ways is it broken? And you mentioned these in your book, and I just want to sort of press on that. Is complexity one of the problems?
Complexity in policy is a huge problem. It's a huge problem. There's so many dimensions to it. It's even a little bit hard to know where to start. But let's just start with the fact that it would have been impossible for a parent whose child was born, say, around 2000, to have any idea that the cost of college would be where it is today. Okay, so already there's this enormous uncertainty that we've levied on parents because the cost is completely unpredictable. Okay, then those parents, as they get closer to the moment where the young adults are going to go to college, don't know how much they're going to get in aid, right? And not only that, year to year, that number can change, even when their children are enrolled in college. Okay.
Right.
And okay. And that's, I mean, I'm just giving you kind of like a schematic.
Yeah.
I'm not even digging into the minute complexities, which are like,
no,
vast.
but the complexity is actually important, right? Because I think one of the things you mentioned, because I think you're talking about the difficulty of planning. And, given that, more than half the people in this country get divorced, I mean, you can't envision things like that, right? What sort of impact that's going to have on the kids' education. And that leads to even more complexity, doesn't it? That, what does it even mean to define a household or a family?
Right. Well, right. All of that. I mean, because every student who is applying for aid has to fill out this thing called the free application for federal student aid, which whenever I mentioned it in my interviews was struck some a chord of like boredom and terror in the hearts of the people that I interviewed. And the FAFSA form requires, well, technically, young adults who are supposed to be filling out the form to report what their quote unquote household income is. And there are so many assumptions built into this form, like that young adults have any access to what their parents' income might be. And that's true in the best of marriages, let alone when you have two parents who are divorced, let alone when you have parents who are divorced, or worse, actually for students, separated but not divorced, where one of your parents has gone missing. Okay. The idea that we're going to involve the families in paying for college has so many complexities built into it because it requires this family unit to report an income and then have that balance against a set of responsibilities which are completely out of date, that are all of this is measured within this pre-application for federal student aid, which leaves young adults in a really, really difficult position.
It seems to be that these are all good intentions that sort of go bad just because of complexity. The Department of Education is this complex bureaucratic machine with all kinds of guidelines that have been put together over decades and are probably sort of held together by rubber bands. And people don't understand it. And, and you talked about sort of the terror of the government doing an audit on you, which they call verification, but it feels like an audit, right?
Oh my gosh, I love the term verification because it's so Orwellian, right? We're going to verify you. It's right. All of us should have terror struck into our hearts. I mean, it's a problem of technocracy, frankly. It's the idea that people in a bureaucratic office somewhere can continue to tinker with policy issues in ways that will quote unquote fix the problem, which only make it more complicated. So, there's a kind of accretion, quote unquote solutions that actually make the policy more impenetrable. Now, we know that good policy is simple policy. Good policy is simple policy. It is straightforward policy. And I am very encouraged by is actually New Mexico's very recent shift toward providing free education for all New Mexicans as a matter of state citizenship. So if you are a New Mexican,
and what happens to the old Mexicans?
What?
Just kidding. I'm sorry. I could not resist.
Well, I hope that they are provided education wherever they are. But in New Mexico, the state legislature has just as of maybe 10 days ago made this a central part of their budget, which is great.
That sounds awesome. I mean, so do you expect other states to adopt this as well?
I mean, that's a good question. There's movement in other state legislatures, even here in New York. The Excelsior program, the idea behind it is to provide tuition-free college to any student whose family makes $125,000 or less. And I say idea because it's actually quite complicated to use. Without being too technical about it, it's what's called a last dollar program, and New Mexico's is a first dollar program. So what's great about New Mexico's payment system is that all New Mexicans know that they're going to go to college for free, and actually the loans that they might take from the federal government or the Pell Grants that they might qualify for can be used for the costs of going to college, which are not tuition, books, living, all of those things that don't fall under this category of tuition.
That sounds like you mentioned Sweden and Germany having a program where loans actually go towards living expenses, books, etc., but tuition is free. Sounds remarkably similar to that.
Yeah, I mean, so that I think is it's a model, and I mean we'll see in the next several years how it works out for New Mexico. But it's even a model that we've worked with in the United States before. So I mean, if we think about the public universities in the United States in the 1950s and 60s and even into the 70s, they were able to provide either free or extremely low cost college for the residents of their states. Right? It's relatively new that the cost of college has become so extreme, it has become a burden, even for middle class people. So when the parents of the students who I worked with for Indebted went to college, it did not press on their families nearly as much as the cost does for their own children. And that's one of the big uncertainties, is that the rise in college costs is so out of proportion to what the experience of an earlier generation was. That's almost hard to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think the costs have risen so much faster than incomes, haven't they?
Faster than incomes, faster than inflation. It's a tremendous rise.
Let's go through like a typical example, right? You point out that debt-free grads make, who are between 25 and 32, make, roughly, 18 grand more a year than those without degrees. And then this gives them sort of an additional ability to pay roughly $300 per month for every $30,000 in debt, which I assume is sort of the average level of debt. And I did the math on that, and that came out to sort of 30,000 by 300. That's like 100 months or 9 years. I was amazed. Is that how long the average payback period is for a college education loan?
So the standard program for federal loans is 10 years. Now, there are, and this gets to the complexity question, other program, there's the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which has gotten a lot of attention lately, which until just this past fall, rejected 98% of the people who were enrolled in it. These are teachers. These are people who work for nonprofits. We can go into that, but there's the standard repayment. It's 10 years. The PSLF can be longer, and the income-driven repayment schemes can be longer than that. But talk about complexity. Not only applying for those non quote unquote standard programs has been enormously complex. Staying in them has been complex. Making the payments that would count was almost impossible. It was a good idea in name to actually stretch out the payment years. I mean, so if you were enrolled in the Public Service Loan Forgiveness or in an income-driven repayment, you could go 20 years.
So what's simple and fair in terms of repayment? You refer to Australia, where you start paying 1% of your debt, where your income is at least 33 grand, and that percentage gradually tears up to like 10% when you hit 97 grand. Is that the kind of template we should adopt, like this Oz model where repayment is gentler?
In other places, yes. So I mean, one of the biggest issue is really bringing down the cost up front. We shouldn't be asking people to pay for fourth grade, and we should not be asking people to pay for sophomore year. That is just clearly my position. Now, whether or not people have to take loans or not, I think that we need to make that option possible, and we need to make repayment easy and very straightforward. And I don't think that we should have private loan servicers doing it, because what we've seen with the public service loan forgiveness program and income-driven repayment is that those companies are not incentivized to get borrowers the best deal possible. They are incentivized to keep people repaying, which is a different thing altogether. The most straightforward answer is to make loans from the Treasury, which is in effect what we already have, and have repayment to the Treasury managed by the Treasury or an agency in the government, akin to the IRS, or actually the IRS, because the IRS already takes payroll taxes, and we could, in effect, roll loan repayment into a similar kind of program, which is exactly what Australia has. So if you ask Australian graduates what's happening with their loans, they don't feel actually like it is burdening them much, because they never see it. And the kind of terms that you're talking about, that people don't repay unless they're making a certain amount of money, and then there's a tiered system about the percentages that they repay, they never have to deal with that at all. It's done behind the scenes at the level of the Australian version of the IRS.
I guess we've kind of privatized this thing, right? We have loan processors and they've got to make money. And so there's this whole ecosystem where everyone's got to make money for this system to kind of work for them. And, I wonder, and this comes back to sort of the point I made earlier, which is that, are we just encouraging people to take too much risk by assuming debt that's really going to burden them? And then that also sort of leads to, the cost of education going up, right? Because you've got people taking loans to make tuition payments that keep going up. It sort of almost seems like a positive feedback. Get people to take more loans, keep pushing tuition up. I mean, education's become sort of a luxury good, hasn't it? I've seen these charts that show the cost of education in the last 20 years, and it's just off the charts as to how it's increased.
Yeah, the cost of education has increased tremendously, but I would start from what we need as a society. We need teachers, we need nurses, we need primary doctors, and those are people who take loans and don't make a lot of money. Right. And those are the people who are supposed to be supported by this thing, the public service loan forgiveness program, and who are not. Although President Biden is working to try to fix that and has fixed that in many, many cases. But I would say that it is not a luxury good, because it is a prerequisite for a stable and good income. So it's a requirement. If you want those things, which I mean, who doesn't want to have a good life, a shot at a stable life, a shot at a good income? I mean, that is just the most fundamental part of any kind of American dream, American belonging. Right? We're not talking about mansions. We're talking about teachers. We're talking about nurses. And I think that we really need to keep those people at the front of our imagination when we think about what an education is. And if there's anything that we've learned from the pandemic, it is just how essential teachers and nurses are to the functioning of absolutely everyone. So when I'm doing my research, those are the people that I try to think with. What is going to benefit one of the nurses in Michigan who I talk to for my research? What is going to benefit, a teacher in a school district in Idaho? That's what I want to know.
So let's move to sort of advice to kids and their parents, right? I mean, you've gone in depth into 160 of these case studies. Looking back, what advice would you have given Kimberly? Would there be anything different that she should have done, that she could have done? What are the sort of general patterns that you've taken away from your research where you can, boil it down to, here's how I should think about where to go, how much, you can afford to take on, etc.
Yeah. So as an anthropologist, I always start from the framework of the people that I'm working with. And I actually don't presume when I'm doing my research that I have better answers than they do. They are the experts in their lives. They're the ones that really understand what it is that they need. And so my job is always to learn from them rather than to give them advice. Outside of that, I think that having debt is detrimental to young people. I think that we can really see this from the patterns of wealthier people whose children do not graduate with debt. They have the option to graduate them with debt. They have the option to take loans, but they don't, right? So why wouldn't we want that for all of our kids? And so I do think that families, even without those means, should look for a college or a university that is going to enable the greatest range of possibilities for young people, both educationally and then after they graduate. And that does mean taking into account what it is going to cost. Now, I think that we have given people a lousy set of choices. Lousy. So that, I say that within that framework, knowing that, in fact, the advice that I give is within a set of choices that are clearly not built in order to give young people the best choices, and which really, really, really need to be remedied.
The sense I got from reading your book was that, between the government loan programs, university administrators that are trying to sort of put together these packages for students, etc., that we don't really sort of warn people about the risks that they're taking. We want to make their dreams possible, right? We want them to, come to our college. We want to put together the best possible package for them. But I guess it's not really our job to, like you said, advise them on fiscal prudence. But shouldn't it be?
Well, I mean, I think that would be presuming a lot that we knew about their lives, and I think that they're the ones. I'm
not saying that we need to know anything about their lives, but I'm just saying that maybe we should induce them to be more aware of risk taking. Right, that people, you talk about it's sort of, something that comes to mind. You said these people who are heavily in debt, they think in the immediate future and then the very distant future, right? It's almost like this middle is missing, right? They still have aspirations of home ownership. So we sort of encourage them to, pursue their passion or fulfill their dreams and, take on that loan and put together a package for them. And no one does that for them.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's a very good question. But what I found was that parents, in particular, knew very well the risks that they were taking, and they tried to let their young adults know that loans have risks as well, but that in fact parents would do most anything for their kids, and particularly to secure their kids' futures. And the way that they that parents in particular thought about this was to bracket the far future. So when I would say, well, but what about your retirement? You're going to need to pay $30,000 for your student to go to college. What about your own retirement? And in general, what people would do, they would say something like, they would laugh, right? Which is pushing it off. And they would say something like, oh, we'll see about that. Or they would make a joke about their retirement. I'm never going to retire. I'm just going to work until I die, right? And that, to me, really said, they know that there's a problem. They know that whatever money that they take from their own retirement accounts is something that they are going to have to reckon with later, but that their children come first. Their children will, and I think as a parent myself, it's very obvious why that's the case. My children will always come first. And that is very much also part of what it means to be middle class in the United States, is to put your children first. And so by doing that, they're actually fulfilling part of that kind of fundamental sense of belonging.
Very well put, Kate. It's more of an emotional or a moral issue than an analytical one. Right. And yet at the same time, you mentioned the fact that people have a hard time talking about money, that oftentimes the kids aren't aware of what their parents are doing to send them to school, right? And if they had been aware of that, I don't know, maybe they would have made different choices, right? So oftentimes it is this sort of reluctance to talk about money and talk about reality that seems to get people into trouble. I mean, that's sort of that was one of the takeaways, that there's certain things we just don't talk about. We'll just do them. You're important to me. You should you should have the best possible education. Yeah, we all want that for our kids, but yet at the same time, there seem to be in a lot of cases not an adequate consideration of how is this thing really going to work?
Well, I think that there's a lot of shame involved because, as we know, the structure of the economy has really changed since those parents went to college themselves. Right? So the likelihood that those parents are making as much as their own parents is not, for sure at all. It is almost a sure thing that those parents have already not saved enough for their own retirement. There is a real sense of failure on the part of middle class people that we have engineered through the structure of this economy, and through asking them to pay for college at the kind of costs that they are facing. So we've engineered a situation in which the parent generation feels an enormous sense of failure and shame, quite likely, or I guess they want their children to be able to move into the future without having to bear their parents' failure, right? Or to bear their parents' situation. So even if a parent is very successful, it is likely that the children don't know about their financial situation too, because our kind of a fundamental democratic value is that young adults should start out on a level playing field.
Just to sort of, before we wrap up, At the end of the day, what advice would you give young people now, as they prepare for college?
I have I guess I have two pieces. One is that there is a very wide range of colleges that can provide an excellent education, a very wide range of colleges, and that I hope that people will consider all of the full spectrum. The other is that everyone should read Ron Lieber's book, How Much You Should Pay for College, and which has contained in it lots and lots of very specific advice, very well thought through, and from the position that Ron Lieber says he understands that money is feelings, and so is paying for college.
That's great advice, by the way. And I think I'm going to go read that book myself. I should have read it prior to this conversation. Would you advise people to have certain kinds of skill sets for the future, just given the speed at which things are changing?
I think that preparing for uncertainty is the best thing that you could possibly do, and I think that preparation can come in many different guises, and we have even seen, based on the work of David Autor, the economist, that you can be a humanities major, you can be an English major, a poetry major, a religion major, and that actually in the long run, your wages will be just as good. So I don't think that we can presume to know today what skills are going to be useful tomorrow, but we do know generally that learning how to learn is the most useful skill of all.
Great advice. So I guess to that, the one piece of advice I add sort of semi-facetiously is that, you might as well learn the language of our future overlords, machines, and become facile with handling information. So even if you're studying Mongolian poetry, you'll be better off if you actually know how to feed that Mongolian poetry to a computer and ask it to maybe extract the nuggets from it. I'm being a little facetious here, but not completely so, right? I feel that somehow for the future that's ahead of us, it reminds me of something that John Sexton said, which is, follow your passion, but keep your material needs low, keep them modest, and you will have a joyous and fulfilling life. So, I was just sort of struck by that. And, that made a lot of sense to me. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is, add a little bit of something to your toolkit so you're prepared for this sort of future world of information, because that sort of seems to be that seems quite certain to me. Not much uncertainty about that.
I think that's right. And I think that if you're studying Mongolian poetry, you are learning a lot about grammar and the structure of language, and that is going to set you up very well to talk to our machine overlords.
Well, Kate, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your time. I really enjoyed reading your book. And so thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Vasant. It's been great to talk to you.
Likewise.